Shane, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yes, of course. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I was introduced to you about a year ago from a principal, and she showed me some of your work. And first of all, you are a phenomenal educator. I know you're very humble, but you are an unbelievable educator. And your work, everything seems to be what's best for all kids, but you really take care of your kids who traditionally struggle. That's why I wanted to have you here today.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, well, let's jump right in. So when we talk about what's essential for neurodiverse kids as best practice for everybody, I want to start there. So what strategies do you use in your classroom that are best practice for everybody, but really essential for those who traditionally struggle?
So I kind of want to start with where this lens of mine for how you structure a classroom and a lesson came from. And it was when I was co-teaching with one of my special education teachers. And we did that for a couple of years. It was the best couple of years of teaching that I had ever had because I learned so much. And when you learn a lot and you know exactly what students need and you're able to meet them where they are, they blossom. And then you blossom and everyone is just excited to be there, right? So I think the biggest, and I would say even the smallest thing that teachers can do is keep your lesson structure consistent from day to day. I was not in elementary. And so in elementary, we teach everything. We don't just teach one class, which I know for secondary, it might be actually even easier to do that, is to keep consistency. But I'll speak specifically to the elementary lens. If you are able to, let's say, take an ELA lesson and you have a lesson structure that it flows the same way every single day, students know exactly how to show up, they know exactly what to expect, and they know exactly what's going to be expected of them. And the content changes every day, and maybe the activity might be slightly different, but in all honesty, they're going to be more successful. And some people might say, well, that's boring.
That's the pushback from teachers. I don't want a boring classroom. But what happens?
You have increased engagement because students know how to show up. Because when you have disengagement, a lot of times, when students are not motivated, a lot of times it's because they don't quite know what they're supposed to do. But if they know exactly what they're supposed to do and exactly how to show up, they are really excited to be there because they know how to be successful. And that's really what we want them to do, is to feel success.
That is music to my ears. So first of all, thank you for incorporating your special education teacher.
Yeah.
As a special education teacher, sometimes you go to the room and they're just like sit in the back and help out where needed. And then other times you get teachers like you, and it's so refreshing when you're implementing best practices. So thank you for that. And then the second thing you said, all the research backs that up. When we're not guessing, especially the kids that struggle, when they're not guessing what's expected of them, we see their gifts shine through.
Yes.
The piece of feedback which you addressed was, is this going to make my class boring? And I think you and I both argue the content is twice as cool because they know what's expected.
Exactly.
What does that do for anxiety on top of these executive function skills, having this consistent classroom?
Well, speaking from someone with anxiety, just knowing what is going to happen and what to expect, that in itself brings anxiety down for students and for their teacher as well, right? Yeah. Because they know exactly, again, and I'll say it over and over, how to show up. They know what the behavior expectations are. They know what materials they're going to need. They know what potential cooperative structures are going to be used, or that they're most likely going to be using some sort of thinking map or graphic organizer, right? They know what's going to happen, even if they're still learning. They're not also learning what the expectations are on top of learning content. So you can bring that cognitive load down and you can focus on the content.
That is a great point. And how do you implement these routines and these structures at the beginning? Because the piece of pushback you and I always get is, I tried a routine and it just doesn't work. Mm-hmm. So how did you do it when you were a teacher?
Well, you got to iterate, right? So you start with one structure and you try it out, you see how it goes. And sometimes it's about pacing. Maybe there's too much in the structure and you're not getting enough of your lesson through in the time that you have allocated for that lesson, right? So then you go back and you say, okay, I still need every component here, but what can I shore up? What can I shift? What can I change? Oh, students were sitting too long and they are disengaging because they are tired or they've been sitting there now for 30 minutes. We don't want students sitting and listening to us for 30 minutes. So it's a lot of, honestly, trial and error, and it's going to be trial and error every single year because every single class is different. We can't do the same thing every single year and expect the same exact outcomes because we're going to have different behaviors and personalities. And so we kind of have to see what works for each dynamic of students, if you will. So I wish I could say something a little bit more specific. And in education, if we had a silver bullet, we'd all be using it.
Of course.
So it really is that there's small iterations and tweaks, and don't think you have to overhaul everything. It just means that we need to look at the small things that weren't going well. okay, students were getting a little antsy. That probably means they were sitting too long. How can I break up that time with a cooperative structure or even a movement break, right? Like, how am I getting them involved, and how am I also doing less talking?
What a great point. I know as a teacher, I felt when I was a first year teacher, like if I wasn't talking and lecturing, like I wasn't doing my job. Like it felt weird just sitting there.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And that's a really hard habit to break.
Well, and as someone that's working now at the district level, and like I do elementary language arts, we tell our teachers we want to see more student talk than teacher talk. We don't want to sage on the stage. We want a guide on the side, right?
Yeah.
We want someone who's going to do a mini lesson on content, but we want them to be putting the cognitive load on students to be doing the talking and thinking.
Thank you for giving everyone permission to do that.
Yes.
Because sometimes it feels weird because that's how we grew up is you found it, you had a lecturer, you sat still and you were quiet and then you reproduced something.
Exactly.
And so thank you for helping, shift that dynamic, especially for our kids with ADHD or executive function challenges who we know that's just not how they learn.
No. Well, and what we end up seeing is students are masking and mimicking. So when we do have those really strict expectations of what they're going to do, when we don't allow them to actually grapple with the content, we just expect them to regurgitate the content. We see a lot of mimicking, which is just copying, and they aren't actually learning the content and they aren't being able to transfer that content later on. It's just kind of showing up for that moment in time.
Can you pick that out as an educator or someone who observes classes? Can you pick out who is just mimicking?
Yes.
How do you do that?
Well, because you can tell if you just engage with the student. Tell me what you're learning about.
Got it. Okay.
Tell me more about it. If they can't elaborate on anything, we don't know if they're actually learning the content.
Which is the reason for the student talk.
Correct. We don't want regurgitation.
How did you incorporate movement in your classroom?
Oh, sure. So movement routines, what was really cool was the elementary school that I started my career in was a movement school. So we did movement. It was throughout the day, 20 minutes in the morning. And then on Fridays, we would all get together and do all school movement. So for me and my students, it wasn't like this, oh, she's going to make us do movement, because it was just the culture of the school. But research shows that if you take like a 20-minute walk, your brain is more active than if you've been sitting for 20 minutes. So we want our students actually active and moving. And that doesn't have to be, they're doing circuits in the classroom, although I have done that.
A highly active classroom.
Yes, a highly active classroom at the beginning of the day. Like, sure, we'll do some circuits. It could be a walk and talk. So you're still using your content, but you might pair a cooperative structure with it. Stand up, hand up, pair up. Like something that's just getting them up and moving. We used to have this great building where you could walk around the hallways in one big loop, and they would pair up. They would talk about the content. I would give them something to what I would call chew on.
Yeah.
And they would discuss that question as they walked.
When I talk about movement in the classroom, teachers overthink it. They do think it has to be a circuit, and they don't realize you can just walk around the classroom a couple of times and be good. But I've never heard the give instruction, give like a targeted think, pair, share type thing while you're walking around the building, around the classroom. That's awesome.
Well, and that's small. And then if you wanted to get more complex or more complicated, like I used to do, I never was trained in whole brain teaching, but I really loved the idea of pairing movements with content. And so we would pair gestures and movements with content all the time. So students knew, the 5 expository structures, and they knew the movements for them. We would use it for math terms, any type of vocabulary, academic vocabulary specifically that they needed to know. We would pair movement to it. And so then if you do need that movement break, but maybe it would be really good for them to review their expository text structures, because we're going to be talking about cause and effect today, and we should probably review that. Okay, you all do the movements for all 5 text structures, define them, talk about them, and that's going to be our jump-in point for now our lesson.
It's so cool because, again, most people view movement as even if you give them a topic, it's really basic, right? And you're talking about doing high-level thinking through moving, which is so cool. And there's a lot of research to back that up now, too.
I was going to say, all the brain science supports the fact that it's a dual code, and it actually helps them remember it for longer periods of time. When
you're coaching teachers, what are other simple movement activities that you give them?
Cooperative structures, pairing it to content. Honestly, if they have just like a short burst, do 5 quick jumping jacks at your table, or like we used to do chair squats, right? Yeah. Like something really small that doesn't take a lot of time. It keeps them in their space, but it also gets them active and moving. That would work too.
Well, to piggyback onto that, the number one question I get from teachers when they start to explore this movement in the classroom thing, they're terrified that they're going to lose control of their classroom. The behavior management piece, they view chaos.
Yes.
And even if we know sitting still and looking at the board is not best practice, well, at least they're contained and in control, right? Mm-hmm. And so it terrifies us educators to get our kids moving. How do you develop behavior management so movement's not a big deal?
Well, it would definitely be chunking how you roll that out, right? So we don't start the first day of school and just say, okay, go. We're just going to start doing all of these things. It's a small rollout and chunking of expectations. And so it's giving the expectations explicitly, naming exactly what behaviors I would like to see. It's showcasing and modeling those behaviors explicitly, and then also giving non-examples explicitly. So I'll tell my students, all right, we're going to do this, and what I don't want to see, and I'll show 3 different things I don't want to see, so that when it does happen in the classroom, it's a quick redirection. You see a student showing one of the unexpected behaviors, and you go, oh, we already talked about that. And they've seen the model of what's expected, what's unexpected. And it's an easy shift for them because they've already been shown and they've been told.
Moving on from movement to a new routine. I think the bane of high school teachers' existence is students who don't turn in their work. What routines or what suggestions do you have for teachers who they just can't get their kids to do homework?
Well, I think I would ask first is what routines have we set up together with the student to help with that? And that might be just prioritizing, right? Are we helping them learn how to prioritize their work so that they even get it started? Now, getting it turned in is a whole nother issue or question, but it also would depend on how big was the assignment. Was it a large project? Have we chunked that for students? Or I would say instead of just one student, could we just chunk it for all students? An example being, so I get to teach this really awesome concurrent enrollment class this year with high schoolers who want to be future educators. It's called Language, Identity, and Power. And we have this big project at the end of this semester where they have to do a funds of knowledge project. They take a case study that we created and they talk about kind of all the pitfalls the teacher fell into and how they might utilize funds of knowledge to increase student outcomes and student engagement in the lessons that were in the case study. And it's a big project. It takes about a month. And last year when we did it for the first time, we kind of just gave it to the high school students and we realized we were chasing them down for each component, right? Does that sound familiar?
Yep. It was everything. It was my entire job for a few years. Yeah.
Yes. And this year we sat down and we're like, well, so that didn't work. How could we be more intentional about it this year? So instead of just handing the entire project over and saying it's due here, I chunked the entire project. We introduced the entire project. We showcased it. We showed some models of what was done last year. And then we said, okay, on this day in class, you have this amount of time to get this part of the project done. And then whatever you don't finish is homework, because the next day when you come back, this part of the project you get to work on in class. And it also was great for us because I was able to chunk my feedback loops.
I was just saying, because everything you're saying, it's especially with having ADHD, we need these quick feedback loops on this big project.
Yes.
Or we get bored or we procrastinate primarily because we're overwhelmed. And so having feedback loops for ourselves as educators is probably just as important because we can see where the whole class is going wrong pretty quickly.
And it's what's helpful for the educator too, right? Like you're creating a timeline for yourself so that you don't get to the end of the project and go, oh my gosh, I didn't give enough feedback to anyone. And now look at my scores.
And the stress you have. Because a lot of this, it sounds like more work, but we're trying to open up some mental clarity. I would think you would have a lot of your grading done and you're not grading over winter break as much because you've chunked this out along the way.
Oh yeah. Well, and with concurrent enrollment, I have to have grades in by the time the universities need it, which is in December.
Yeah.
So there is no grading over winter break. It's got to be done.
It was through necessity for you. Yeah, the quick feedback loops on these big projects, it just makes your life so much easier, but it sounds so complicated.
I wish people didn't think it was that complicated because it's quite literally creating a timeline for your students and a timeline for you. It was, okay, if you need to have this content done on day 1, day 2, I'm going to feedback loop you on what you did on day 1. And then in the meantime, when I'm not able to work with you because I'm working with someone else, you're working on day 2's content, right? And it kind of progresses just like that. Is it perfect? No. And luckily enough, I have a co-teacher, right? So there's 2 of us giving feedback and it goes faster that way. Some other ways that teachers might consider are like AI generated feedback questions that they can give feedback to themselves. How might you set up routines for peers to give feedback to one another, right? How might you duplicate yourself if you're the only teacher in the room with different types of feedback loops as well?
That's great. Well, because it also helps with behavior management. It helps with all these other things.
They're not just sitting there twiddling their thumbs and scrolling TikTok because now they're bored.
Absolutely. No, they're working on, like you said, day 3 when everyone else is on day 2. You're differentiating. It's great. How do you give them feedback loops with AI?
The feedback loops that I've created has been more, here's the rubric. I'll put the rubric into Gemini and I'll say, can you generate different questions to help students reflect on how they approached the rubric? Really small. But also that's something I don't have to do anymore because Gemini's doing it for me. So I might regenerate a couple of those questions, maybe regenerate them to be a little bit more student facing rather than teacher facing. Depending on what grade level you're working with, you can ask it to create reflective questions specific for second graders, right? But what I love about AI is that it helps us be more productive and less time spent on the stuff like creating the questions and more time spent with students.
Actually, one thing we've started doing with AI for our ADHD kids is when they're done with their project, upload their project and the rubric. Because I know even on projects growing up that I worked really hard on, I would miss parts of the rubric. And they could tell me right away what I missed. So we've seen that work really well in high schools as well. It's like, oh, you missed these parts. Let's just do these real quick before you turn it in.
Yeah. Well, and what I'm really excited about, my school district in St. Vrain Valley in Longmont, Colorado, we are going to be piloting a new AI program next year that is student friendly. So we can actually have it be student facing, but the teacher can create spaces within the AI where you put in the rubric and you put in different resources, but those are the only resources that the AI is pulling from to give feedback, or students could research, but you've provided the specific sources.
That's super cool.
Isn't that cool?
For good or for bad, that's probably where we're going in education. Right?
It is, but how great to have a space where students can do that, because I work in a district where they're really concerned about student privacy, as they should be. And so ensuring that the programs are keeping student privacy safe is at the top of our priority list. And they found a program that they're going to be able to do that.
That's awesome.
I know.
So cool. I asked you about doing homework. What about turning homework in? I know growing up, I did my homework and I just assumed everyone knew and I never turned it in. It was just in the backpack still and then everyone would get frustrated with me. I'm not the only one. I'm sure you've heard this a million times. How do you coach teachers on helping students take the next step and follow through and actually get it in?
It would be about creating a routine for homework turn-in, right? Something that's teacher directed, because obviously at that point, it can't be student directed until it's internalized. So what is a way, again, that small rollout that we can start it as teacher directed, it becomes internalized, and then it becomes student directed. Whether that routine be, it might be a turn-in box with a paper on the side where the student highlights their number. It's not a name, it's a number so that it's anonymous, but they highlight their number once they've turned in their homework. Something that I did, we had cubbies in the back of the room and I would have 3 students per cubby and there were doors on them. So I put folders on the inside of the doors where they would put their homework. And then at a glance, I could quickly go through and be like, who had their homework? And then whoever didn't have homework in the folder, I just check in. Hey, did you get that done last night? Oh, you did? You did? And it's in your backpack? Great, go put it in your folder.
And it's great. You're not calling them out in front of everybody and it's so fast.
Yeah. So it's small things like that. How can we make it visual for the teacher? The highlighter example, right? That's visual for the teacher too. Which numbers are not highlighted? I should check in with those kids.
Yeah.
So again, it's just a routine for both the students and the teacher.
I think the number one comment or question I get right now is around procrastination.
Yes.
Especially from educators. How do we even start to think and work on this procrastination thing?
Well, guilty.
And we all are, right? I'm always giving advice that I'm guilty of myself.
I always start with, well, what works for me? Not what works for me works for everyone, but it is coping mechanisms that can help. And so the first thing is, what's the root cause of the procrastination? Is it that the project is too big and we need to chunk it? Is it that we're not sure where to start? Is it that we don't know what we're doing? Or is it that we just have so much on our plate that we don't know where to start and so we freeze and we don't start anything? It's a lot of different wonderings. So one of the things that I was doing with concurrent enrollment students again last year was they were not turning anything in. And it was because they had so much on their plate that they didn't know where to start. I asked them, how do you prioritize your work? And they all just kind of looked at me and went, what do you mean by that? And I said, okay, so I'll teach you a way that I prioritize my work as an adult and how I used to do it as a high school student and see if it works for you. And if it doesn't, that's totally fine. We can work on a different way. But what is something that is going to work and be sustainable? And I think that's the biggest thing is you can try something once, but if it doesn't sustain and you can't use it as a consistent tool, then it's not helpful to you. So what we did, I actually had them all get onto their Infinite Campus, and I would say, okay, based on all your classes, what are the assignments that are due in the next week? Wrote down all the assignments. Okay, great. Now I need you to reorder or resequence those by what's due first.
Yeah.
Then they would resequence and like what was due first. And I say, okay, look at your top 3. Out of those top 3, what's something that you feel like is a shoo-in you can get done real quick so you can feel some quick success? So they chose the one thing that they were going to tackle first. And I think that that's the hard part, right? Is what are we going to start with? And we want people to feel immediate success.
Yeah, and that's a great intervention for parents and special education teachers as well. In my opinion, one of the worst words you can say at Untapped is should. Because the amount of times we get, this student should, this student should. When you're talking, I'm like, well, they should know how to prioritize, but they don't.
Who taught them?
Who taught them? Who's modeling this? So it's a great strategy because, I mean, you had a room full of high school kids and they just couldn't do it. And for whatever reason, I don't know if that's on us, on them, but it really doesn't matter. So giving them those skills and modeling them, did you see improvement after that?
Oh yeah, I saw an increase in assignments being turned in. And it was actually really good to see that for the majority of the students it worked. There was a few that it didn't work for. And so that was a different conversation. It was sitting down one-on-one with them and saying, all right, how can I support you to make sure that we are prioritizing your work? And so it was going even more in depth instead of just having like, what are your top 3? What are you going to start with? It's like, okay, what are you going to start with? Okay, now let's zoom in on that assignment. Let's chunk that task.
And that backs up all the research because there's a debate whether procrastination is behavioral or emotional. And in the emotional capacity, like what you're talking about, it's we don't start something because it seems really hard and we're overwhelmed. So prioritizing it and then getting as minute as possible to that tiny habits, right? It's like, how do we get this as small as we can so we can actually start it? And once our kids start it, more often than not, they're pretty good.
Oh yeah. It's that same feeling you get when you start a to-do list and then you add a couple things that you've already done that day to check off because you already kind of had some success.
Yeah, absolutely. And now you're on a roll.
Now you're on a roll, you have momentum.
Yeah. When you have 25, 30 kids in a classroom and you have those 2 who are either wild, like hyperactive ADHD, like I was growing up, or maybe they're just spacing out in the back of the classroom. Behavior management's really hard because you have a room full of kids.
Yes.
What strategies would you give to teachers who may be struggling with this?
I think first and foremost, and it might sound cliched, but it's what type of relationship do you have with those students and making sure that it is a strong foundation to start off with, because that student needs to know that you care not only about them, but you care for them. And caring for them is doing more than like, yeah, I like you, you're great. It's no, what can I actively do to support you? Once you have that foundation, there's trust that's built, and it's not built quickly. It's built over time. And so it's constantly showing up, even when it's hard, or even when you think that something is done at you, it's not. Behavior is a tool of communication for students. It's not something that they're doing on purpose. And so knowing that to start is a really great place to leap off of when you partner with the student to figure out what could be done to support them the best. And so I would say strong foundational relationships. And then on top of that, what are you normalizing as accommodations for all students so that what they might need doesn't look different from what other students might need? And that might be access to breaks, hand gestures to let you know that you're going to the bathroom, need a drink of water, etc. Like there's small things that we can put in place that can be helpful for students. Now, the next step is, you specifically said there are 2 students, right? They have very specific needs. Partnering with them is the biggest thing. Sitting down and saying, what do you need? But that's really broad. So during English language arts, I noticed that sitting on the floor while we do our read aloud is really hard for you. Where do you think you would be more successful? Let's try that out for a couple days. Is it sitting in your seat where you have a yoga ball and you can kind of do some bouncing? Is it, I've had times where I've quite literally taped off an area where they could pace back and forth while they listened.
Yep.
Maybe it's just standing in the back, right? So are we just in a formation where you have access to move around just a little bit more? It's not in the front, it's not distracting to others, but you have a little bit more space. And so it's finding what is going to work with that student. And it's not choosing for the student, it's choosing with the student.
And what I love that you said was you build the relationship and then you can have those hard conversations, because those are often very hard conversations when a kid is, really disrupting your class.
Yes.
And so it's a hard conversation. It's like, what do you need so you can be successful? And I'm trusting you to do it, but you have to have that relationship. It has to mean something to them.
Yeah, because if they don't trust you, When you have that conversation, it comes off as, I'm going to tell you that you're going to go sit on that yoga ball and we're going to fix this. And that does not feel good to anyone.
It doesn't, and a lot of us have experienced that for many years before we even get to that teacher. So there's a lot of baggage behind it as well. Yeah. And again, we have so much empathy for teachers because we know how hard of a job it is. But having that relationship, it all comes back to that.
It does. And then I would say the second piece of that is you might have this conversation with the student and you might come up with an action plan together that you might, again, iterate based off of trial and error. I would say the next component to that is you need to call home and you need to talk with the parents or the family of that student. And it's partnership. It's saying, hey, I'm so excited because we sat down and we came up with a great plan. I just want to let you in on it. This is what we have decided. Your student asked for this. You're letting them know they're advocating for yourself and you are working together. And then additionally, you get some more insight potentially from the family. So it might be, what are you doing at home that is really working that maybe we could also do in the classroom? Because I want to keep those consistent trends.
Yeah. And you're not calling home for the first time talking to the parent in a negative way.
No, we want it to be positive. And I think that's also something in education where teachers are wary of calling home because it feels like a gotcha or they feel like the parent isn't going to be responsive. But if we're calling home with positive intent to build a partnership and to not say, oh, your child did this again. It's, hey, we have this great idea and we're really excited to try it out because we think it's going to be really successful. That's a whole different tone and you're going to get a much different response.
A piece of advice I got early on is we all know in the first couple of days which kids are going to be challenging,
yes.
Right? Someone told me to call those parents right away and just be like, I'm so excited to have your son in my class, your daughter in my class. And the first time they'd answer the phone, like their voice was shaking. They're like, already? Like they're already in trouble? And I'm like, no, like I'm just excited to have them. That's it. And then I had them on my side to have those hard conversations like what you're talking about. And the kid felt it even more. Like they really wanted to be a part of my classroom because I took that time in advance.
Yes.
It goes back to this discipline equals freedom thing you and I talk about. It's like this one small action, it does take more time up front. But on the back end, the amount of headaches and time it saved me, it was well worth it.
I always say this to teachers. I go, it feels like work right now, but it's going to pay out dividends.
Absolutely.
And you're going to be less tired later.
The hard thing is you don't know because you're doing the right stuff up front. So you don't know how hard it could be, but yes. It's making a huge difference.
It is.
You spoke to a couple things that you do for every single student, which really helps the students that struggle.
Yeah.
Do you have any more examples, especially for students who are older?
For students who are older, I would say, and honestly, it works K-12. I'll just say that. Like great pedagogy and great practices is just good practice. You would just have to adjust for what's appropriate for the age level. Movement breaks or independent movement breaks could be really great, or maybe even sensory breaks in primary, right? So students could go to the calm down corner, or potentially secondary students can go take a walk around the hallway. But again, you've set expectations around that. They know exactly what's expected, how they're supposed to show up, and how they're supposed to behave, right? So there's very much a structure in place for those breaks. I would say timers. I would have tons of sand timers and tons of visual timers on everywhere.
What does that do?
So for someone like myself who has time blindness, it helps you manage your time more wisely. So knowing that you have, only 30 minutes left to do this assignment, I'm probably not going to talk to my lab partner about where we're going to go for lunch because, oh shoot, we need to finish this assignment. So anything that just makes things more observable, right? It's visual. And then kind of going off of that visual, I would say if you want to encourage students to do dual coding notes, so that's maybe sketchnoting, drawing diagrams, pictures, so that they have more access to that. And brain research shows that dual coding creates two pathways for memory. So they're actually more apt, like we talked about with movement, to actually remember that content, which is really great. And then one of my favorites that I've done not only at the first grade level when I was coaching teachers, but I also did it in, 11th grade in an automotive classroom, right? Like it's, like I said, spans.
Best practice is best practice.
Is creating goals individually with students and then creating a plan of attack. Or, how are we going to reach that goal? And it's just setting one goal for the day. It's going and sitting with that student for 2 minutes and saying, so what's one thing you really want to make sure that you're getting done today or that you are accomplishing today? And then once they identify that goal, well, great, we've identified a goal. How are we going to get there? So build the roadmap. All right, so what are 3 things that you're going to do to make sure that this happens? And so you're building up not only the metacognition around what is my goal, but how am I going to get there?
That's executive function. That's covering every executive functions right there. It's like, just reverse engineering goals. That is what builds every skill that I know we're looking for.
And it's intrinsic motivation, right? We're not saying, okay, if you finish your assignment today, you get a Jolly Rancher.
Yeah.
We're saying you created a goal and you met it. How do you feel? Because it feels good.
Yeah. I mean, those are all great recommendations that span K-12 to honestly college as well.
Oh, yeah.
It spans them all. One that we've seen recently for older students is making sure your assignments in the gradebook match what's on your online portals, because often students who are missing stuff are absent. They can't find what they need to, and it also satisfies a lot of accommodations. Mm-hmm. Same thing with uploading teacher notes and PowerPoints.
Yes.
So you're just PDFing it, you're putting it on your online portals, and the amount of accommodations you knock out, whether it's visual, notes, extra time, it's one act that just really saves you a lot of mental space.
Yes. Here's a tech tip. If you're into iPads, if you're someone who is in secondary and you might do more of a lecture style for short periods of time, but you're lecturing and you might be writing on the whiteboard, perhaps you shift that to be writing on Notability and have the record phase button. Have you seen this?
I have, yes.
And it's great where you can do your whole lecture on Notability and it's recorded and it records your voice as well. So then as you're writing and as you're talking, the entire lecture is captured.
And your students, they don't need to bug you with constant emails and at the beginning of class of, I was absent, what do I do? Mm-hmm. It's the same thing like you talked about with classroom routines. It's if you're absent, here's where you go. If you miss something today, here's where you go. If you zoned out and you have ADHD, here's where you go. And they just get it.
Yes. And it's making sure that you're building those routines ahead of time. I think that that's the biggest thing that's missed is, we just want these things to happen. Well, it happens over time. It's the first 2 months of school or the first 2 months of whenever you are able to start.
Yeah, and it's constant modeling too.
Yes.
I think, we glossed over this with behavior management, but I glossed over it. You did a great job recommending it. You're constantly showing this is how we behave in this classroom, and this is how we don't.
Yes.
And then you're revisiting that, but it goes quicker the second time around.
Oh, it's constant. As a fourth grade teacher, I would have students, before we'd enter the room, I would give them the rundown, and it was like a chunked 3, here are the materials you need, and here's how we're entering the room every single time. From day 1 to day 186, they heard the same thing from me every single time that we had a transition. And it's not because I like to repeat myself.
Of course not.
It helps students keep it top of mind what the expectations are, because honestly, there's so much going on in the day. They're not thinking about what the expectations are when they're entering your room. They're thinking about what happened at recess and wanting to talk to that friend about what happened at recess. But if you remind them of what the expectations are, it's front of mind and they're like, oh, that's right. I'm not talking to my friend right now. I need to go get my math book.
By the way, that was the most important routine I ever implemented in my classroom, was teaching students how to walk into my classroom. I didn't do it for the first 10 years. And when I did, and I was constantly putting out fires.
It's magic.
Yeah. I have 20 ADHD kids coming in. It's chaos. And I'm starting and I'm hooping and hollering. And just that simple thing, you're starting class in a completely different mindset, and your students, they're with you.
Yeah. And again, coming back to when they know how to show up, they feel successful, and they are engaged and motivated to be there.
Absolutely. We're about ready to enter a new year.
Mm-hmm.
When teachers come back, if you could give them one piece of advice, what would that be?
I think it would be, look at your lesson structure and see if it's consistent. And that in itself is going to fix a lot of small problems that you might be seeing in your classroom. What I love about consistent lesson structure, and we've already kind of touched on it, is that it's great for students, but it is also helpful for the teacher planning, right? Because you know what you're going to be doing. Your content is just slightly different. So it is kind of plug and play, right? If you have a consistent structure. But once you have a consistent structure, then you can be really mindful of what cooperative structures are you using, what movement breaks are you implementing, and really actually looking at what are the small things that students are needing, because I've kept this consistent. So now I can actually dig into, okay, there are still some things that aren't going perfectly. It's never going to be perfect in the classroom, but there's still things that are happening that I would like to see improve or get better. And now that you've created consistency, you're able to have the cognitive load to dig into what are the small things that I can now focus on.
Such a great piece of advice. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for all you do for our students and our teachers and our community. Thank you so much, Shane.
Thanks, Brandon.